information on the type of diets used. And one of the key components which led to the FDA and EFSA discrediting these results was that there was a very high and variable spontaneous incidence of infection and inflammation, which they thought could be confounding the results in terms of the levels of leukemia and lymphoma. FDA also criticized their use of their statistical analyses, and they said that the lumping of all tumors together to come up with a statistically significant value was an inappropriate analysis. The data also showed no dose-response relationships. The effects were only reported in one sex. And as I mentioned, there were some inconsistencies in diagnosis related to this infection leukemia issue. And one of the big question marks that was raised by both EFSA and the US FDA was that there was no peer review of any of these pathology slides. So they didn't allow any external pathologists to review the slides to determine whether the effects that they noted were appropriate or not. So in summary of the results, we can say that the Ramazzini results are uninterpretable and unreliable due to flaws in study design, conduct, and reporting. And with a high and variable incidence of leukemia that is difficult to differentiate from inflammation. So, these results were not considered credible by the FDA or EFSA. And it also brings into question how these results differ in output from the studies that have been conducted on aspartame and sucralose, which have been reviewed by all of the regulatory authorities around the world. And all of these regulatory authorities around the world, including EFSA and FDA, following the review of the Ramazzini data, still consider that both of these compounds are non-carcinogenic to rodents and have no carcinogenic risk to humans. So the Ramazzini Institute studies provide no credible evidence that aspartame or sucralose is carcinogenic. So, to summarize and conclude, high-intensity sweeteners are approved for use in products all over the world, including all of those sweeteners that I've just evaluated and run through the results with you. The potential carcinogenicity of food ingredients prior to marketing is mainly achieved through testing in rats and mice using these standard internationally recognized protocols. And all of these rodent carcinogenicity studies have shown no evidence of carcinogenicity except for that of saccharin, which I've explained the reasons behind that. Recently, the Ramazzini has published a number of studies, but these studies have been considered to be uninterpretable and unreliable. And these are the conclusions that have been drawn by EFSA and the US FDA. There are no substantive epidemiological studies showing any carcinogenic effects. And so we conclude that the carcinogenicity database available for currently approved high-intensity sweeteners demonstrates a lack of carcinogenic potential. And this is supported through the results of genotoxicity studies, structure-activity relationships, and the pharmacokinetics and metabolism of these materials. This is a viewpoint that is endorsed by all of the regulatory authorities around the world, including the Joint Expert Committee on Food Additives, as well as IARC, who has reviewed the data on cyclamate and saccharin. So in conclusion, this is my conclusion now, sweeteners bear no carcinogenic risk even when exposure levels are several orders of magnitude greater than the anticipated daily human ingestion levels. And with that, I'd like to thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Dr. Ashley. We are going now directly to... Oh, sorry. Ai, eu esqueci da China. Lá era só em inglês. Obrigado, Dr. Ashley. Nós vamos agora diretamente para perguntas e respostas. Gostaria de sentar, talvez, na mesa para responder. Nós temos 15 minutos, então aproveitem bastante e nós sentaremos aqui na mesa. Dr. Ashley, pode sentar aqui? Dr. Ashley, please, can you have a for question? You will be now. I mean, wherever you feel more comfortable. Okay, I will sit.
Bom dia, professor Ashley. Sou Anita Sachs, da Escola Paulista de Medicina. Brilhante apresentação, desmistificando, inclusive, muito do que se tem conduzido aí pela imprensa em relação aos adoçantes artificiais. A minha questão é a seguinte: o senhor sabe se existe diferença e o que seria melhor adaptado, por exemplo, à realidade do Brasil em relação à dose máxima diária recomendada por tipo de adoçante para os indivíduos, em relação às diferenças, por exemplo, de recomendações americanas, dos Estados Unidos, e a europeia? Obrigada.
Okay, so no, that's a very good question. And one of my slides that I showed outlined the acceptable daily intakes for the various sweeteners. And those are universal, pretty much universal, acceptable daily intakes, and they are derived from the long-term carcinogenicity studies that I spent considerable time explaining. There's two ways of determining what the human exposure levels are. And we can do this through using food survey databases. In the US, that's the NHANES. In Europe, it's the comprehensive database. And what this does is estimates what the exposure to a sweetener is going to be if you use it at maximum levels in all of the different food categories that it's permitted. This is a very conservative method and usually provides levels of a very high intake. In reality, that intake is never achieved. There's been 3 recent publications, and when I say recent publications, one is just about to come out, that have been conducted in Europe, where they've been looking at the intakes of exposures using post-marketing surveillance data. So what they've done is they've calculated through analytical procedures the levels of the sweeteners in the various foods and determined how much of this has been consumed by the individual. So when they've used this sophisticated methodology, which is what I would classify as real-time exposure, real-life exposure, as opposed to estimated exposure, the levels of intake are far lower than the acceptable daily intakes. And I think this gives me great comfort in that, you know, the exposures of humans to sweeteners are never ever going to reach those acceptable daily intake levels.
Ok. Por favor.
Ana Silvia.
Pode. Bom dia, parabéns pela apresentação. Eu gostaria de saber por que existem tão poucos estudos com humanos. Porque, na verdade, seria o melhor sujeito para se estudar esse tipo de efeito ou não. Então, hoje já existe há muitos anos o consumo de adoçantes, talvez pegando uma população que são que usam em maior quantidade, comparado com outros que não usam, talvez pudesse ter um dado mais preciso e real em humanos.
When you talk about data in human beings, you're talking about epidemiology data looking at carcinogenesis? Yeah, I mean, that is a very good point, but I tried to allude in one of my slides that while such information would be very important to have, for high-intensity sweeteners, it's very difficult because there's so many sweeteners that are used in the marketplace. So to be able to tease out the effects of one as opposed to the other is incredibly difficult. If you want to lump all of the sweeteners together, then that is a more viable objective. The trouble is, at the end of the day, as I tried to explain in the first part of my talk, these materials are so different in terms of structure and the way they are handled that you really can't say that it's high-intensity sweeteners that are carcinogenic because they are totally different. So in reality, it would be very difficult, I think, to conduct an epidemiology study just looking at one sweetener.
Mas eu acho que isso é a realidade. As pessoas usam vários produtos que são edulcorantes de vários tipos. E aí eu pergunto, será que com a metabolômica, hoje em dia, não se poderia chegar a resultados mais precisos e poder dizer com certeza, olha, não tem nenhum problema? Eu acho que seria interessante esse tipo de estudo.
Oh, I definitely agree, but the cost of conducting such a study would be, yeah, probably prohibitive in a lot of respects. But, yeah, it would be a nice study to have, that's for sure.
Muito obrigado pela sua palestra. Eu acredito que o jogo do Brasil hoje vai ser 3-1 contra o Paraguai. Essa não é muito a minha área, mas se eu fosse iniciar um estudo, quer dizer, primeiro que o adoçante não é um nutriente. E segundo, que o objetivo dele é atingir a papila lingual. Então, se eu tivesse que procurar uma alteração celular, eu ia procurar no trato digestivo, na mucosa do trato digestivo, começando pela boca. E eu não vi nenhum desses relatos nos seus trabalhos. Talvez estejam implícitos, estejam incluídos no estudo. Mas eu gostaria muito de ter isso e, como diz a professora Silvia, estudar muito a metabolômica. É uma metilação, a hipermetilação, enfim, o que está sendo procurado para mostrar a carcinogênese ou não. Obrigado.
Again, the carcinogenicity studies that are conducted to standard protocols that are laid down in the FDA Red Book or OECD, they outline all of the tissues that should be analyzed from a histopathological point of view, and that does include the GI tract. So those organs will be evaluated. In terms of, again, moving forward into conducting further human studies, I do agree. It's, yeah, maybe that's something for the future. Not only for high-intensity sweeteners, but many other types of products, ingredients. Yeah. We tend to single out high-intensity sweeteners, and I'm not really sure as to why high-intensity sweeteners are targeted so much in terms of, the data that Professor Toledo just identified. It's as though we're trying to bring down the use of high-intensity sweeteners because of potential adverse effects, but no adverse effects have really been noted as yet, as far as I know.
Thank you, Ashley. It's okay. Thank you, Ashley, for your presentation. As you say, in preclinical studies with high dose of sweetness, some studies showed carcinogenicity, but a very high dose. Do you think that it happened the same with another food or drugs that we use normally in our life? Or like drugs. I think that there are some examples of other substances or moleculars which happen the same as sweeteners. High dose in preclinical studies showed carcinogenicity too, but this is not mandatory to stop the clinical trials. Do you think it's okay?
No, I mean, I think there's a big difference between food and pharmaceuticals. If a food ingredient is shown to provide any carcinogenic risk, then that food product should never be permitted, no matter what the level of risk is. In terms of toxicity, if you get some toxicity at a high dose level, but there's no effect at a lower dose level, then you can use that as your no effect level from which to derive an ADI. But in terms of carcinogenicity, I don't think that there's any recall but to prevent that ingredient from being marketed.
Actually, could I ask a question? Do you have examples of candidate low-calorie sweeteners that failed to pass the tests that you describe? I think that might be reassuring to know that it does screen out harmful substances.
In fact, I do. I mean, I'm not going to can't give you the names of any of these compounds or the companies that I've worked for. I've spent 30 years of my life making the world safe for high-intensity sweeteners. I've pretty much worked on every high-intensity sweetener that I've outlined to you today. But there has been companies that have spent huge amounts of money developing a high-intensity sweetener, which has fallen at the final hurdle because of safety, not necessarily carcinogenicity concerns, but other safety concerns. And these companies have spent many, many millions on developing those ingredients and getting to the final stage, and then we say, sorry, because of these safety concerns, we cannot move forward.
Sim. Vamos fazer mais uma pergunta e depois encerrar para irmos para o coffee break.
Bom, eu queria cumprimentar pela apresentação, pela importância do tema. O que me deixa intrigante, me intriga, é que, de um lado, nós temos os estudos mostrando que tem esses efeitos nos animais, e, outro lado, mostrando que não seguiram os protocolos. Não deu tempo para fazer um estudo adequado, ou não há interesse que esses grupos lá do Instituto Ramazzini proceder com um estudo adequado para atender essas exigências? Porque nós ficamos na mesma situação. Eu imagino que nós vamos ter que sair daqui hoje com dúvidas ainda, né? Did you understand me? A little bit.
Are you talking about the Ramazzini studies?
I'm talking about mostra que tem diferença, que não seguiram os métodos. Por que não se faz um estudo, então, e mostra um estudo adequado para ver se diminui essa dificuldade para a gente entender os resultados? Porque nós continuamos na dúvida ainda, apesar de todos isso. O que prevalece são os dados negativos, infelizmente.
I agree. It's unfortunate that always the negative data prevails over the positive data. I can only state that, these weren't my opinions. These were opinions of the European Food Safety Authority and the FDA, who spent a considerable amount of time reviewing the data and the reports that came out of the Ramazzini Institute. And they saw that there was a considerable number of flaws, limitations, which they felt limited the usefulness of those studies. I think it's up to Ramazzini now to go back and conduct studies to standard protocols to show that, yeah, no, these are real effects. But I don't think they will ever do that. Of course, yeah. I mean, the reason behind doing a lifetime study is that it's different from the standard regulatory processes that are in place. And don't forget, those regulatory processes that are laid down by the FDA and the OECD are specific to look for adverse effects. You know, they're not there to, you know, prove that nothing is unsafe. They're really designed to show an adverse effect if one occurs.
Dr. Franco Lajolo, a última, hein?
Obrigado pela deferência. Você vê alguma possibilidade de interação desses adoçantes influindo no fenotipo, no microbioma intestinal, de alguma forma significativa?